Good afternoon, everyone. I am Stephen Reed, Sounds Learning Solutions Manager, and I would like to thank you for joining us on today's webinar. As always, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you have questions during the webinar, type them in at the bottom of your webinar control panel, and we will address them at the end of the session. Additionally, we are recording the webinar, and we will be sending the recording out to all attendees. Now, I would like to turn things over to Rob, Dr. Bessler.
Thanks, Stephen, and welcome everyone around the country to our clinical webinar focused on SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 illness. So super glad to have you all on today, and hopefully plenty of you are listening and follow up since we are recording this in the middle of a clinical day. Just have a real expression of thanks for everything that each and every one of you do at Sound each day. It's incredible the work you do on a normal day, and now going in each day and night to work with the threat of COVID is just tremendous. But I also want to just express optimism. I feel like, you know, we have incredible data. We're preparing for our upcoming board meeting around how the mortality has dropped pretty significantly in the patients we're caring for. I think we're getting smarter and learning more in not only the pandemic, but the infodemic, lack of information out there. And I'm pretty excited about the progress and the 1A recommendation around dexamethasone in patients needing oxygen that are hospitalized, and some of the progress in the background around the vaccine. So a lot of things to look forward to, and super interested in hearing from our clinical leadership team here today. But before we get started, I want to introduce our Chief People Officer, Annie Fowler. Annie, take it away.
Hey there, guys. I'm Annie Fowler, Chief People Officer, and I am here with also Dr. Nate Ruck and Dr. Greg Johnson, and they had asked me to come and talk to you all a little bit just kind of generally about our people. So I'd actually like to extend Rob's thank you for everything that you're doing on the front lines. It has given, I think, every one of us here behind the scenes even more sense of purpose and meaning in our work to be able to support you in doing what you're doing out there fighting the battle. So Dr. Nate Ruck had asked me to come and talk to you a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and just move to our first slide. And wanted to show you some things that make me feel good, I will say, in that couple of things that we track here at Sound to kind of tell us about how people are feeling is we always look at turnover, which tells us, are people voting with their feet, right? Are they willing to stay here with the organization, feel valued, and what do those numbers look like? And then another big metric that we look at is, are folks referring their own friends and colleagues to come and work at Sound? So those are two things that are a little, to me, a sense of endorsement around working here at Sound. And what this graph just shows kind of at a high level, and obviously we could double click into each one of these things into very specific buckets, but overall, we are seeing still very favorable trends in turnover, meaning people are coming to work at Sound and are coming here to stay. Now, there's probably some noise in this number, right? We've got a bomb dropped on us with COVID, and there may be, you know, circumstances where people are obviously not out looking in the job market and that type of thing. And so maybe there's some noise here that people are sticking around, but maybe not for commitment reasons, but who knows, right? We need to be able to kind of look into that piece. But I like to think of this in an optimistic perspective of we're creating an environment where people feel valued and that they want to be a part of this organization and that they know the organization cares about them. And so I wanted to start with that slide just to show you this. To me is, all right, we've kept some momentum. We got to keep looking at this, and we got to keep thinking about our listening strategy of learning more about how our people are feeling. So if we go to the next slide, I put this slide together to kind of take a look at maybe how our people are feeling. And what you probably don't know is that back in March or April, Dr. Mark Rudolph and I had been working diligently on deploying our Press Ganey Wellbeing Assessment Survey. Well, no surprise, we had to put the kibosh on that because there was far more important things that people needed to do fighting on the front lines of COVID. So we put that on hold. But at the same time, we've been trying to get a feel for how people are feeling about working here at Sound, and do they feel supported, and are they enthusiastic about their work? And so what we've done here is kind of look at an assessment and a rating that we're giving ourselves. And what you can see on the reason for the assessment, some headwinds and some tailwinds that we see kind of in both of these, all of these categories. And I think in general, what I would say without reading from a slide, which I don't want to, is we kind of bucket these into commitment, like how people are feeling really committed to Sound's mission, vision, and strategy, and really feeling like they want to go the extra mile because they enjoy the work that they're doing. And then in terms of belonging is, do they feel like there's an inclusive organization, that they can be themselves, like look forward to coming to work, and those types of things. So the headline here, the good news is I don't think we're in any red right now. We definitely have some areas of yellow, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I think there's some mixed blessings that have come with COVID. And one of the things that we continue to hear from our clinical population, but also our business population, nurses and so forth, is that for better or worse, this battle, where it's in the healthcare, we're at the epicenter of it, has given us a sense of pride in the work that we're doing and this feeling of personal accomplishment, whether it's a more connection to the profession of being a physician or the things that we're doing as business colleagues behind the scenes to really make sure that things are running effectively and efficiently, and that we're providing good service, and really an obsession with our front line, making sure they're able to do their work. And so that's been really positive. People have doubled down and said, I even have friends and family asking me about how it is where I work, and asking for guidance and those types of things. So that's been neat to see that connection. I think as we continue to see that this is going to be sustained for a little bit longer, and hopefully we all get a shot in our arm here in the near future, but until that actually happens, we have to really continue to think about giving opportunities, allowing people to grow in their careers, making sure that they're getting the support with their own growth and development. So that's kind of hard in a macro environment where we ourselves have had to look at the business and think about potentially how the business has changed in the wake of COVID. And we have had to look at some resizing of some teams based upon the long-term prospects of that piece of the work that may not come back. And so that's led to some fear and some job security concerns. And so we address those as much as we possibly can. We feel very optimistic about our ability to really weather the storm with some strength. And so we've got some new investments in talent development. What you guys as clinicians are seeing is if you're taking advantage of any of what would have been our live events, whether it's onboarding, crescendo boot camp, RMD insights, these different things that we have, we've now moved this really migration to virtual learning. And what we've learned so far is it's actually received some really positive feedback. We've leveled up the way that we are delivering the content through some interactive collaboration platforms. And so we're really trying to bring that experience. So our physicians and our clinicians, when they're coming to onboard with us in our APPs, that they're still feeling culturally integrated into Sound. And so that's a real area that we're going to continue to reinforce that work and provide those development offerings. Again, you'll see that people are recommending Sound a place to be where they can choose for their career. I think one of the other things that I wanted to highlight here is I can be myself at work. So what you all are likely experiencing in your own communities is the growing call for organizations to really think through a lens of diversity, how we are creating an inclusive environment. And Sound is no different. And in fact, we'd had a tremendous amount of work that was going on even prior to the events with George Floyd, but now has really supercharged the way that we need to think about our organization and weaving a lens of diversity into the way we go about hiring, the way that we manage our teams, our retention strategies, promotional strategies. Really, it has to be weaved into the fabric of the organization. And so we have done an initial audit looking at all of our data since 2017. And I think that's really created some insights for us around some gaps where we've also seen a tremendous amount of progress. And so that is really one of my single biggest priorities, is to really push that project forward and making sure that we are meaningfully changing the way that we do our work and leveraging Sound as an organization to make an impact, not only within the organization, but in our own communities. And so that's a body of work I feel really passionate about, and think that we have the arrows going down, because I think that we're going to have to do a ton of work, and it may not feel palpable to our people immediately, but then it's going to turn, the arrow is going to go up. And so that's my goal. I think this area where it says, I look forward to coming to work, you guys feel this probably more than anybody, and talking with Greg this morning, is I think all of us are just feeling this very strange sense of burnout, whether you're on the front lines and seeing not an end in sight, and looking across the parking lot after you've worn PPE all day and seeing people in swimming pools and not wearing masks and so forth. And so there's a level of frustration that people are seeing when they're on the front lines and seeing the behaviors. We're also seeing for our business colleagues, it's hard to always get re-energized when you come up to your home office every day, and we're kind of mourning that loss of the interaction and the travel and the things that we did to create those bonds within the organization. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can kind of bring that back and bring some of that culture really palpably to our people. And so there are some challenges there, not anything different than any other organization is dealing with these days. So all in all, though, I feel great about the work and the communication that we've had with our people through this really difficult time. But it is important for us to know whether or not you're feeling the level of support from a back office standpoint as you're going through the trials and tribulations of fighting a pandemic. And so we certainly welcome any feedback that you have, response times. Anytime you reach out to us, it is important that we get back to you right away and create solutions to your questions. And so I certainly welcome any feedback about that. So with that, I think that was the last of my slides. I believe I'm going to be taking this over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Greg Johnson. So take it away.
Thank you, Annie. I appreciate getting that perspective, and I'm sure we all appreciate just the acknowledgement that the organization is being cognizant of all the different things that not only we're facing, but what it's going to mean and how we can improve as an organization in terms of just improving as an organization, but also how we can address the well-being of our people. So thank you very much for sharing that perspective. This time I'm going to get into the situation report and do the sound update. Next slide is a slide, or at least a visualization, that I believe everybody is familiar with now. And that's the lines, the gold one being the total active patients in sound with confirmed or suspected SARS-CoV-2. So the number as of last night was 4,331. And then the blue line at the bottom, the total of new suspected or confirmed COVID admissions, around 500, almost 600. Realistically, that increased line is consistent with what we've been, both of the increased lines and the slope of the lines is indicative of the surge that we're hearing about in the news, and obviously we're feeling on a daily basis. It's also indicative of the fact that these patients, certainly for our critical care and hospital medicine programs, have increased lengths of stay and are obviously requiring our additional attention. This is a compressed slide, so this really shows only from really May 20th through yesterday, but it's obviously just our data reflecting what we're seeing with respect to national trends. The next slide is really about what Rob had shared before, which is getting a sense of our not only suspected and confirmed cases, but mortality being on the far right, and where I'll start. As you can see, the 75, really the over 65 age group is where we're seeing the level of mortality continue to be its greatest. And the fact that Again, when you look at the over 85 lane, that percentage is low, but that's also because the total number of patients that we see in that age group are a little lower. I think when we're look at the middle column and the breakdown there, your eyes, or at least my eyes, gravitate towards to the green space, which is the 40 to 54-year-old group that has expanded over the past couple of weeks and is again consistent with what we're seeing in the public data with respect to younger patients being hospitalized. I agree with Rob. I think we are taking better care of our patients in aggregate. I also, as we can look at the comparative data, we know that that age group has a lower mortality rate. And so the fact that more of them are getting in the hospital and being hospitalized, at least we know that they're being discharged, and that it's something that we can feel better about, that, hey, we're not going to see as much mortality with respect to the cases that we're seeing, even if we are seeing younger patients. The next slide is really a reflection. So obviously we've focused on the fact that in the news we're hearing about Florida, we're hearing about Texas, Arizona, and California. So we're obviously seeing patients everywhere. But I wanted to make sure that we were cognizant, we were acknowledging the fact that we're still seeing surges everywhere. So in our sound metrics data, which again, we're incredibly grateful for everyone continuing their diligence in making those extra clicks so we can track the COVID patients. This is over the last week in the top 5 sites where we've had largest increases in the number of COVID patients. And you can see it's as far east as Pennsylvania with Crozer-Chester, and as far west as Montana with St. James Health. Obviously, we're still seeing those surges in Texas and our program in Tennessee, just as the top 5 changed over the last week. Acknowledging this is one thing in terms of the data, but similar to our response in addressing the surge that occurred in the New York, New Jersey area, we have already made outreach with the assistance of regional leadership in identifying potential volunteers that may want to come from their sites just to be able to help out. And so anybody who is interested in doing so can reach out to myself, Tracy Carden. We are working very closely with the Gulf and Gold Rush regional teams, as well as ECHO leadership, in facilitating not only state licensure and credentialing at the site level, but also transportation to make sure that we can do our best as an organization to support our colleagues in need, particularly where we have the greatest surge. With that, I'll now transition into a little bit of clinical guidance, and Rob spoke of optimism with respect to vaccines. There's been a lot in both the lay press, but most significantly in the scientific press in the last couple of days. What I'm going to be highlighting are some of the most recent phase 1 and 2 clinical trials that have been reported in both Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine to give just some additional perspective on where we are with respect to vaccines, and help again set some additional expectations around what it can potentially mean for you in your clinical practice. So the next slide is really just a reorientation slide. This has been produced on both of our webinars where we had highlighted, or prior webinars where we had highlighted what's going on with SARS-CoV-2, and you can see the phenotype of the virus itself on the far left. Our focus has been and will continue to be on the blue area, which is now highlighted and it expanded in the middle, which is the spike protein and the receptor binding domain. On the far right are the different stages or the different development vaccine candidates, where obviously we've been spending some time talking about RNA vaccines as well as the different vectored vaccines that are available. So the next slide is to give a broad sense of where we are in clinical trials. Previously, on an earlier webinar, I had shared that there were a little over 100 different vaccines that were being explored out there. And as you can see, there's just been an increase in terms of the total number of vaccine projects that exist out there. You can then see the progress between phase 1, phase 2 trials, as well as phase 3. I wanted to take some time because one of the things that is out there in the lay press is about an approved vaccine. So is there a vaccine that is out there in use? The answer is yes, but the next slide is really going to get into the details of what that means. I will be focusing again on where we are in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. A lot of the clinical trials that are occurring right now are actually blending phases in order to be able to push how quickly a vaccine can get to market. So if we go to the next slide, I want to put the approved in air quotes. We'll go over these 3 bullet points relatively quickly. CanSino Pharmaceuticals, which is a pharmaceutical company based in China, has developed a vaccine. I'll get into the details of the vaccine because it was reported out, as it says in the second bullet point, in terms of phase 2 testing that is currently in progress, or actually is currently being reported. It was actually reported yesterday in Lancet. What came out was that in the midst of their phase 2 trials, the Chinese military did approve this vaccine as a special need drug for distribution within the military, and it has been distributed as a special need for an individual oil company also based in China. So if you hear that somebody says that there's an approved vaccine, well, yes, there is in China. It doesn't apply for what's happening here. And it still doesn't mean that those aren't getting phase 3 evaluation. But this was something I thought was important because, again, the concern about what Rob said in terms of an infodemic, when people hear that there's already approved vaccine, you need to know what approved means. Next slide is, again, a busy slide, but I want to really get into these reported vaccine trials. I'll move from left to right, moving through the titles first. The first one is the 85 vectored vaccine. This is the CanSino vaccine that I just mentioned on the prior slide. In the middle is ChAdOx1. This is frequently referred to as the Oxford vaccine. And then the mRNA 1273 vaccine, again, most commonly referred to as the Moderna vaccine after the company that is actively working on it. So returning first to the 85 vectored vaccine, again, Chinese pharma company, it's focused on replication defective adenovirus 5 vectors, and again, focused on the spike protein. This was exactly what I stated before. It's moved incredibly rapidly from initial development in May, phase 1 trials then, to phase 2 that was initiated before phase 1 was completed. And now they're still evaluating it for phase 3, even though the military Chinese military has already approved it. For the Oxford vaccine or ChAdOx1, this is a chimpanzee adenovirus, and the chimpanzee adenovirus was used specifically because there was success in this particular vector for MERS and SARS. And so the ChAdOx is CH, chimpanzee, AD or AD, adenovirus, and then Oxford, again, focused on the spike protein. And in this particular vaccine, there were animal trials, and again, a lot of encouragement because with the vector and this particular approach with at least macaque monkeys, there was a clear humoral and cellular immune response. Finally, on the right is the Moderna vaccine. Again, this is a different delivery system in terms of the lipid nanoparticle. It's mRNA based, but again, it's focused on the spike protein. This seems to be the way that most people are approaching vaccines, as been previously mentioned on earlier webinars. If we go into the next slide, it's really the highlights from the trials, and there are a lot of similarities with respect to what has been revealed, and I think reflects the optimism that Rob shared initially on this webinar. Now, reminder that phase 1 and phase 2 trials are really focused on safety. And do they do the job that we ask of vaccines, which is, do they produce an immune response and are they safe? And we're going to get into the definition of what safe is when we get into the limitations on a subsequent slide. But the vaccines appear to be safe, meaning that there were no severe reactions that were recorded. They do seem to stimulate neutralizing antibodies as well as T cells. So that's a lot of room for optimism because nothing severe for patients, and it seems to produce the appropriate response. The big issue and the caveat that goes with this is, for the excitement for the first bullet point, there's still no comment on clinical effectiveness. We don't know if they actually protect against SARS-CoV-2, but it looks like they should. And that's, again, the purpose of phase 1 and phase 2 trials. The other component that's going on that was studied was that each vaccine examined both single and booster dosing, a second dose. Part of the reason they were looking at second dosing was, at least in comments from some of the vaccines, there was a clear indication that for patients over the age of 55, there didn't seem to be as significant an immune response. And so there was an evaluation of whether, again, secondary dosing was going to be safe and produced additional neutralizing antibodies. It looks like it did for all three potential vaccines, but again, more studies are to come. And again, when we're looking at the safety profile, most of what occurred were really just manifestations or milder manifestations of the disease, not so much the shortness of breath and cough, but the fever, fatigue, myalgias, and headaches. Next slide, please. So as with anything, studies and evaluations of these vaccines have some limitations. The CanSino vaccine really was a focus on all the participants were from Wuhan. And of note, and they highlighted this fairly extensively in the report that's in Lancet, the anti-adenosine 5 immunity that exists in China is not necessarily reflective of what occurs globally. So the level of immunity in China for anti-adenosine 5 is a little over 80%, and that seems to be consistent in other global communities like India. But if you look at what the anti-AD5 immunity is in a place like the United States, it's only about 30%, which means that there's some concern that this particular vector may not necessarily be safe in all populations. For CanSino, there were no children. There actually were no children in any of the other ones that are reported here. And when we're talking about safety, we have to highlight that the CanSino to date, they were only checking up to 28 days post-vaccination. So there's a lot more information to come about if there are any long-term side effects. The Oxford vaccine, again, only looked at about 56 days out. And again, significant limitation is that the majority of volunteers were young, healthy, and white, not necessarily consistent with the patients that are highest risk for severe sequelae of COVID-19. Moderna didn't report out a whole lot of limitations other than that they just hadn't reported, they only reported data out 57 days post-vaccination. But again, Moderna's report was slightly different in that they were just making comments on the progress that we're making on the vaccine. So the only other commentary that came from these papers outside of the general optimism that we're making progress is that none of these particular vaccine projects looks like it's going to be available for 2020. Most are commenting on mid-2021, despite the enormous push to make sure that a vaccine is going to be available, certainly for healthcare workers, and then eventually for global populations. But this was really intended to be a summary. I encourage anybody who likes to take a look at immunology. These are well done reports for all three of the vaccines. Again, Lancet as of yesterday and New England Journal as of 1 week ago. With that, I'm actually going to turn over to Nate, and he's going to provide a testing update. So thanks, Nate.
Thanks, Greg. And I just want to pause for a moment and say how much it warms my heart to see you wearing a headset and how much better your sound is, Greg. It's really made this better for me, and I think better for everybody else. So testing. A lot of good news to report on testing, in addition to the optimism, Greg shared around vaccines. So if you look at how many Americans are being tested on a daily basis, we've exceeded 800,000 tests on a number of days. This data extends through July 19th. The one, less than great point on here is the percent positivity. The blue line is the 7-day moving average of percent positive tests. And really what we'd like to see is that, sustained below 5% as it was in mid-June. And now in many parts of the US, we're seeing testing positivity percentages that are quite high. And really what that means is that, you're not at a place where the pandemic is under control. And, this probably isn't news to anyone. I'm not sure what's going on with the Puerto Rico data in the right-hand column here, but the states that meet the positivity recommendations and are under 5% positive, you could see a partial list on the left. The worst of the worst in terms of percent positive, I think Puerto Rico is an outlier, and that's probably not accurate data, but Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, are all, really by testing data experiencing pretty substantial strain, and probably when you have a positivity rate that's that high, your testing isn't representative of the full scope of the infection. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about the test types that are available, these can be divided into two broad categories. So there are viral tests that look for evidence of the virus itself, and these, there's really two broad types, and we're going to talk a little bit about the second less common type, which is antigen testing. The test that's most common are tests that look for, they amplify fragments of viral RNA. Most common mode is through PCR, and these look for presence of the virus's genetic material and then amplify that material. And these are really useful tests to see if someone is currently infected. They don't really give you any kind of look back or historical information, and they don't prognosticate about potential immunity moving forward. Now, there are also antigen tests, and some of these have been approved through the emergency use exemption for use at home. And we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of those in the subsequent slides. In one of the past webinars, we dove into serology tests, and really those can be divided into 4 categories, which we'll look at also in the subsequent slides. But these look for antibodies to the virus, and some serology tests look for neutralizing antibodies. Some serology tests just look for the presence of antibodies in general. And these tests aren't super useful for diagnosing active infection. And no one really knows exactly, if these prognosticate the presence of antibodies that are protective from future infection. And I think the other thing that's worth noting is particularly the point of care lateral flow antibody tests are all through emergency use authorization, which is a little bit of a Wild West approval pathway. So I think they need to be interpreted and utilized with caution. So what are the various types of serology testing that are out there? There's the lateral flow, tests, the rapid diagnostic tests. Those are the ones that, probably you need to be most careful interpreting the data. There's ELISA testing, which, look at, can the antibodies inhibit virus growth and give you, or actually they don't really tell us if the antibodies inhibit viral growth, but they do give you kind of a presence or absence, and they also give you some qualitative information in distinction of the RDT tests, which only really give you qualitative information. And then there are neutralizing and chemiluminescent assays, and really this is similar to Greg's content in that this really is just the tip of the iceberg. The majority of the information here is from 2 sources. Johns Hopkins has a testing project which has really a lot of detailed information, and they have a living document that's kind of a roadmap to how testing should be utilized, and we'll include that in the show notes, and it's really a great place to look if you want to dive into this in more detail. The kind of too long didn't read version of the serology testing is that the lateral flow rapid point of care tests aren't super useful, and the other species of antibody testing really should only be interpreted with assistance of an infectious disease colleague. So how about antigen testing? So these have also been approved through the FDA emergency use exemption pathway. I think another name for that would be the Wild West pathway. You know, with this, there's a lot of vendors entering this space, and the way this emergency use exemption works with the FDA, as we've discussed previously, is, you know, you kind of show that what you're doing might make sense, but you don't have to present any data. The data can be seen by the FDA later. And there's already been some pretty large lots of testing in the US that have proven to be fraudulent. So I think with antigen testing, this has some great potential positives. You know, the way these tests work from a chemical standpoint, they're very much like rapid strep tests, and they're super specific. They're kryptonite that they lack sensitivity. They give you a very rapid answer, and they definitely do have the potential to be viable home tests. Now, they have a downside in that there's, because of the way they work, some potential for cross-reactivity with other coronaviruses, which cause illness, but nothing like what we see with the disease phenotype of COVID-19. So the other news on the testing front that's new since our last update is that the FDA has really abandoned the idea of a test-based strategy for return to work, except for very rare circumstances. If you want to, you know, and this happened late last week, and it's really great news. The consensus among virologists, infectious disease physicians, and epidemiologists is that there's this subset of people that have persistent positive NP swabs for viral DNA. And the thought process there is that these people actually aren't infected, but they're still having these viral particles on their NP swab. And if you keep these folks out of work, some people will shed inactive viral particles for weeks or even months after infection. So they've abandoned this test-based strategy, and I think that's great news that clarifies the pathway toward folks getting back to work. I wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of what's out there in the milieu in the scientific world. We've really seen some, you know, as people have rushed to press with research around COVID-19, there's been some pretty tremendous and unprecedented things happen with big name journals like Lancet and JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine, where research from fairly prestigious authors has either been retracted or the data is found not to be supported on further analysis. And, you know, the National Academy of Sciences, their Proceedings journal is, you know, right up there with Nature as probably the most prestigious journal in the world. And a little over a month ago, they published online this research article which had a Nobel laureate among its authors, Dr. Molina, and, you know, they felt that airborne transmission was the dominant route for spread of COVID-19. And it turns out that, you know, really the majority of authors on this article didn't have a deep background in epidemiology or virology. And 6 days after it was published, there's a letter sent by 45 epidemiologists who are really a who's who of the field, kind of demanding retraction and saying that this is, you know, low quality research, that there were fundamental flaws that really can't be overcome, and that there shouldn't be a modification of the article. It should simply be removed. Now, this is still being sorted out as we speak, but it kind of dovetails with a concept that I wanted to highlight. And I think that this is articulated much better than I ever could on this webinar by a piece in the New England Journal that was published online 5 days ago by, I'm not going to try that first name, but Dr. Schwartzstein and et al. And basically what this is it's just a quick 2-page read that I would encourage everyone to take some time to look at. And what it does is it kind of unpacks the mistakes in thinking that physicians are susceptible to when you have something that's unprecedented with a lot of uncertainty happening, and how it's normal to look to perceive patterns in data that's really random, to use anecdote to manage patient care, particularly when it's so frustrating, right? I mean, this is a super frustrating condition to treat. You have patients that are dying, and really the main mode of treatment is supportive. There's some, there's remdesivir and there's dexamethasone for patients on oxygen, but there really aren't any, game-changing treatments. And there's so much uncertainty and so much morbidity that there are some cognitive errors that have clearly been made by the leaders in many fields of medicine, and I think that we're all susceptible to. So, taking a look what's in this article and unpacking what they have to say around availability bias and around just how, it kind of normalizes some of the thinking that we've seen. I know for me, where I work clinically, there's a, kind of a triple Ivy League trained pulmonologist who is just truly excellent. And in the early days of the pandemic in March, he came out with this treatment protocol that was just incredible. It had all these things on it, hydrochloroquine with or without azithromycin, interleukin-6 inhibitors. And now when you look back at that retrospectively, really he was falling into a lot of the traps that are outlined in this piece. And I think it's something that is important for all of us to read and keep in mind. And we'll include a link in the notes to this presentation. So one of the things that has been getting Sergio and I and Greg up early in the morning and keeping us up late at night is, boy, this is really kind of a challenging new set of circumstances for all of our specialties to exist under. How can we provide tools that lead to a sustainable practice under the conditions we're all under? And to that end, we're going to present another tool today. And I'll just start by saying we know up front that what we're presenting in these tools, they aren't going to resonate, with everyone. For some people, the idea of, working out more and doing some yoga, that works great. For other people, that is just not for them. And what I'd like to do is present today a tool that I've heard Annie talk about and I've heard Mark talk about, which I think has some utility. And this comes from the military, from the US Army. And they have this concept called a battle buddy concept. And what I'd like to do is just unpack a little bit of what this is about. And you could take this back to your practice and see, does this idea work for you? And does this, some of you are probably already doing this organically. When I describe this, you probably already have someone you work with who's essentially your battle buddy. But so what is a battle buddy and what is this all about? So as I said, this is created as a peer mentoring and peer support program to inoculate people against stress by the US Army. And the idea of what the battle buddy accomplishes is they validate your experience, they help you identify stressors, they help you take that identification and then take the next step and employ strategies to mitigate the stress. They help you keep work at work, and they help you develop and maintain resilience so you can, keep on keeping on under difficult circumstances. And, who is the ideal person to serve as your buddy? This first bullet was a little counterintuitive for me, but when I read into it a little more, it makes sense. This really isn't somebody who should be a super close friend of yours. You should share a working environment with them and about the same level of seniority, similar stage in life. And most importantly is probably the last thing, which is that they should be able to be supported and objective when assessing what you're doing and providing feedback. And so mechanistically, how does this work? What does your battle buddy do? They check in with you briefly, they listen, they validate, they provide feedback. And importantly, they identify issues and help you kind of understand what's written on the back of your t-shirt emotionally and behaviorally as you're dealing with stress. And they also help identify operational issues that need escalation. Sometimes when you're working in a tough environment, you may identify something that's an issue for you, but it's only after that experience is validated through talking with someone else that you realize, hey, that's not just me, that's something that's on the mind of everyone. Maybe that needs to be escalated so we can do more. And so how does this check-in work? You ask open-ended questions, you're not judgmental, and you can use those on the menu here. And I've already heard from some of our emergency medicine teams that they like this strategy. So I wanted to take some time to present it here. Hopefully it'll work for you and your team too. So shifting gears a little bit, we still have an inventory of PPE available, and as cases have increased, we've been dispatching supply to some markets again. The request form is here on the Knowledge Center. You need approval from your your RMD. I'll reemphasize what we spoke about the last couple of times on the webinar, which is that if you're wearing an N95 mask and being exposed to respiratory aerosols, it's critical that you take time to make sure you get fit tested. And even if you're using a mask that's from outside your facility, if you don't have a great seal against your face, you're not being protected in the best possible way. So this we've gone through before. I think that we talked a little bit about last time, kind of the last highlighted point. Definitely have seen some relaxation of social distancing in team rooms and at break time. And I think the data based on droplet precautions really suggests that if you maintain that, you're going to enhance your safety. We talked about eye protection and provided some links last time. There's some research to suggest that that could be an avenue of transmission for some. Intentional hand washing and really creating a culture where it's okay to call people out if there's gaps in what they're doing, I think is critical. And we wanted to reemphasize that. I'm going to take a few moments and go through some support lines and resources that are out there. So this is a screenshot from a website. This is not a sound related thing. This is a group of psychologists and psychiatrists who are volunteering their time to be available for clinicians who are stressed. I think they've actually expanded their hours from when I made this slide, and that but they are open 7 days a week, and open for at least 16 hours of the day. And the idea is that these are people that provide free and confidential, no appointment necessary. And this is a resource that may be helpful to you or helpful to others on your team. I would encourage you to distribute the information. We continue to offer our peer support program and EAP. Here's some detail here on that. And we'll distribute this whole deck so that you can make it available to your folks. And this is some further detail on the peer support program, which is newer to Sound. And I know Mark has talked about that before, but just briefly, these are clinical peers within Sound who have undergone special training. And if you're uncomfortably stressed or traumatized by something, and it doesn't need to be COVID related, could be, medical error, an unexpected death, a disagreement over management, these are great things to reach out and use this resource. All this and more is available on the new Wellbeing portal, which you can access through multiple modes: soundphysicians.com, Sound Connect, OWL, what you see here. As always, I would encourage you to give us feedback. We work very hard to create this content for you, to give you timely information and help you wade through the infodemic that Rob described in his opening comments. You can submit questions, comments, requests for more via chat. I think that, for me, I would just close with a, heartfelt thank you. I think it's been said before, but it can't be said often enough that in these challenging, difficult times, our communities and our patients have really never needed us in the way they do now. And, the work that we do has always been important, but I think it's really never been more important than it is now. So with that, I think I'll pass it to you, Greg, and see if you have any final words.
Thanks, Nate. First, I'll actually reach out to Stephen. Are there any questions? Well, I'm not sure if either one of you guys has access to any questions that are coming from the field.
I've got the question chat up, and I think that that's a mea culpa on my part from a housekeeping standpoint for not giving folks time to enter any. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And if not, that's fine. You can always send us an email or reach out to us in any way.
Well, as Nate stated, we can't say thank you enough. We appreciate your time and joining us with the webinar, whether you're doing it live or you're dialing in a little bit later. To his point, these are for you. We've received and continue to answer questions through COVID-19 at soundphysicians.com. And we encourage you to please continue to reach out and ask your questions. That does inform not only this webinar, but the service line specific webinars that we deliver. And we're making sure that these occur in a regular cadence so that way you're able to access them, get the information that you need, and help you through not only your clinical day, but just in terms of being able to migrate your way through all of the information that is out there. And so I'll end with that, with a thank you, and thank you to Nate for helping to make sure that we stay on track.
Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. And remember, we're here to support you. If there's something you need, big, small, in between, please let us know. Have a great day.
Nice job, guys.